Hey, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I am Suzanne Basala. I'm the President and CEO of the U.S.-Japan Council, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar on mental wellness. The U.S.-Japan Council, if you're not familiar with us, we develop and connect diverse leaders to create a stronger U.S.-Japan relationship. And we were very proud of our history of having a forward-looking agenda and addressing issues that are important for the U.S.-Japan relationship early so we can have important discussions. And one of the real strengths of the council is we are a council of members. Some are friends of the council, council leaders, board members, and associates, but everybody joins the council with a contributor's mindset and looking for an opportunity to work together on issues of importance. And we're just powered by our networks. So one of the things we've been doing for the last couple of years is having affinity groups, which is a chance for our members to not only connect with our shared interest in a strong US-Japan relationship, but to find other ways to connect of shared interests, experiences, identity. And the Mental Wellness Affinity Group is something that's been envisioned actually and initiated by one of our members, Dr. Gerald Hane, who you'll hear from in just a little bit. And the Mental Wellness Affinity Group has been meeting for the last several months, having really rich conversations with each other about important issues in US and Japan around mental wellness. And today our group decided to open up to a more public forum and invite others to hear and be part of the conversation. So please feel free to turn your camera on. It's always fun for the speakers to be able to see some of the people that they're speaking to. And feel free to connect with each other and us on chat during the conversation. No, none of this would be possible without our sponsors. So I would like to take a moment to particularly thank our platinum sponsors, Amazon, American Airlines, the Aratani Foundation, Deloitte, Fabit, and MUFG. I'd also like to thank our title sponsors, the CPB Foundation, which is Central Pacific Bank, Google, Hitachi, Island Insurance, Ito-En, Mitsui & Company, NEC, Oryx, the Terasaki Nibei Foundation, the Toshizo Watanabe Foundation, and the Toyota Research Institute. We're also supported by a number of signature and premier sponsors. It's more than I'm going to be able to read right now, but hopefully you saw the names earlier. We'll be continuing to show this list at the end, and you can certainly read our list of sponsors at the link that's provided in the chat. So I would love to talk about mental wellness and give you a lot of why I think this is such an important topic, but I want to make sure that we reserve the time for our incredible expert speakers. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to USJC Council Leader, Dr. Gerald Hane, who's joining us from Singapore, where he's a senior executive at Hitachi Asia. He's also a researcher with the two Japanese think tanks, HGPI and GRIPS. So Gerald, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Suzanne. So please allow me to briefly introduce the webinar as well as our speakers for today. Okay. So during this period of COVID restrictions over the past 2 years, the majority of adults in the US and Japan have in surveys expressed significant anxiety or depression. In both societies, this experience has expanded the discussion of the importance of mental health. We've also learned that there are many approaches to strengthening our mental wellness, and we see differences between approaches used in different cultures, such as the US and Japan. At the same time, we learn that we have a long way to go to reduce the social stigma still associated with mental health and to make mental wellness resources more available. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us individuals with deep experience with mental health and wellness in both the US and Japan. They will touch on insights that we can gain from cross-cultural perspectives, as well as challenges that remain. Kathleen Pike is a USJC Council Leader and a professor of psychology and director of the Columbia WHO Center for Global Mental Health at Columbia University. Stephen Murphy Shigematsu is the head of the Heartfulness Lab and consulting professor at Stanford University. Yuri Sugimoto is a global communications officer at Kyoto University. and was formerly a postgraduate fellow in the Mental Health for All program at the Harvard Medical School. She was also a 2021 Tomodachi Story Jam for Youth and Disabilities participant. And our discussant is Curtis Takata Rooks, a member of the USJC Board of Directors and Program Coordinator of Asian Pacific American Studies and faculty in the Department of Asian and Asian American Studies at Loyola Marymount University. Before we start with our first speaker, a quick comment to the audience. If you have questions, please enter them in the chat box, and we will try to get to these after the speakers have presented. We also thank those who have sent their questions in advance. So now allow me to turn to our first speaker, Professor Kathleen Pike. Professor Pike.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My mandate is to start with big picture and a bit of context, and then to share with you some of our observations from the research and clinical community about differences and similarities that we're seeing across workplace and academic settings for youth. So big picture, I just want to put in context this moment in history. It was Victor Hugo who said, "There's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." And I would say that our time has come for mental health, and people are talking about mental health around the globe in ways that we have not seen before. And so that is a bit of a silver lining for us as we think about the last several years and the impact of the pandemic. In fact, I can tell you that a number of years ago when I was in Japan, I was asked by a major multinational corporation to speak to their workforce about mental health. But the catch was that I wasn't allowed to use the word mental health because that was too provocative and would be off-putting for people. So the world has changed, and there's very little hesitation at this point, in fact, to talk about mental health or mental illness. And I think that offers us enormous opportunity. And we're seeing that in the US, among different communities in the US, as well as Japan. So what I want to first highlight is there are lots of questions that always come up related to the pandemic and what's happened in terms of mental health and the pandemic. And the story, there's no single story to mental health and the pandemic, but a few things that I'd like to highlight. The first is that we have data from Japan and from the US that immediately after the first round of the pandemic, so in early 2020, studies indicated significant increases in stress, in anxiety, in mood disorder or mood symptoms, both in Japan and the US and across the age span. The thing that's really important to note is that for many people, the impact, the urgency of the pandemic at the beginning was significantly associated with the experience of stress and anxiety and depressed mood. And many people, by the time surveys were being conducted, by summer of 2020 or fall of 2020, many people had returned to sort of their baseline status. But there are groups that are more at risk. And so to highlight the groups that are at risk in particular, in the context of the world we live in today and the added stresses, are individuals who were closest to the acute situation of the pandemic when certainly in the US, less so in Japan, people who were very close to the death toll that the pandemic had at the very beginning. So healthcare providers had a very significant mental health impact. And again, most of the individuals will return to baseline, but those who are at particular risk include those with pre-existing mental health conditions. So those who had mood or anxiety disorders prior to the pandemic. I'm sorry, does someone have a question? Nope, okay. The factors will be pre-existing conditions, how close people are to the severity of exposure related to COVID, and broadening that out in general. The closer someone is to some kind of traumatic event, the more likely it is that they'll have a more pronounced mental health response. And the third factor that's really significant to consider around mental health in any particular context is what support are people getting from community? And here we can really see certain differences in terms of Japan and the US in response to the pandemic, and ways in which communities were able to mobilize and support each other that would either result in worse or better outcome. So one of the things that was predicted at the beginning of the pandemic was that older adults were going to fare worse than the young people. And in part because the virus had a more lethal risk for older adults, and in part because older adults tend to live alone, and there was a lot of containment around visiting and increase, therefore, in terms of social isolation. What the data show us, which is really interesting and something for us to consider, is that both in Japan and in the US, older adults fared much better in terms of mental health than was anticipated. They definitely reported feelings of loneliness. They definitely reported elevation in terms of stress. But in terms of their mental health, they actually fared very well on average. And the group that was at more risk were young people. So adolescents and young adults tended to report elevated levels of stress, elevated levels of isolation, but then elevated levels of anxiety, depression, hopelessness, and the symptoms have tended to endure in comparison to what we've seen for older adults. The other thing that we've seen that's really dramatic about the pandemic is that the mental health implications have been more significant for women compared to men. In part, this is because the implications for women in terms of multiple roles, so needing to care for older adults, needing to care for children in ways that were increased during the height of the pandemic, tended to fall more in a gendered way to women. Additionally, women tend to be hired in certain kinds of roles that were more severely impacted. So in terms of caregiving roles, paid caregiving roles for either older adults or for children, in roles in women also tend to be in more part-time positions, and all of those positions were more significantly impacted in terms of livelihood. More women lost work, and as in the United States, the percentage of women who are gainfully employed dropped precipitously and actually has not returned to pre-COVID levels. So we're seeing an enduring impact on women in terms of gainful employment, which translates into financial stresses for many women, which translates into mental health stresses for many women. One of the things that I want to underscore about the entire journey of the last few years is that there's been a tendency to what I would say is conflate stress with mental health conditions. And so people tend to think that if they're stressed, that that's a mental health condition, which it's not. And stress is one of those things that's gotten a lot of bad rap over the years. But in fact, a little bit of stress actually can be quite beneficial for all of us, right? So consider, for example, knowing that you're going to have to take a major exam. That's stressful. Having that stress in place helps us focus, helps us organize, helps us decide that we're not going to go out to a party tonight, but instead going to study. So there's a utility to stress. The thing to consider about stress is that when it becomes overwhelming, too severe, when it endures for too long, and when we see impairment, right, that's when we start to move into the categories of mental disorders. And so we want to think about that and distinguish that, because especially for young adults who are feeling especially stressed, this is an opportunity and a time to consider what the stresses are and to figure out what you have agency over and what you can, in fact, how you can use the stress as an opportunity for growth, and when you need to ask for help, right? And it can be both, right? It can be an opportunity for growth, and we need some help at times. One of the next points that I'd like to make is that even for young adults, where we're seeing significant elevations in terms of mental health symptoms, it's not across the board, but it is among particular groups. Again, unfortunately, young women are showing more symptoms than men. But that tends, or in terms of reporting mental health conditions, women tend to report more symptoms sooner and seek help sooner. So there are ways to, this gender difference is not unique to this moment in history. There are really good data that leaders can do a lot in terms of helping people cope with their mental health, these mental health stressors, and actually manage the stressors well. So when we think about opportunities going forward, both among the younger segments of the population and through the across all cohorts here, as we think about the opportunities for leadership to talk authentically about mental health, to have workshops like this where people can share real life experience and talk about the ways in which stresses have put their mental health at risk and ways in which they've responded, and help that's been useful, can really go a long way in terms of building networks of support and building communities where prevention and promotion around mental health really work. So I think I should stop here and turn the floor back to Gerald, and we'll be here for more conversation and discussion later on.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Pike. Okay, let me next invite Professor Murphy Shigematsu to offer comments. Professor Murphy Shigematsu.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Wait. Okay, yes, we can now.
Good? Okay. So I'd like to follow Dr. Pike's comments with some of my own that will build on what she was telling us. When I first heard the title, I thought, this is the story of my life, strengthening mental wellness through Cross-Cultural U.S.-Japan Insights. And, my own life as the the child of a Japanese mother born in Japan when it was still occupied Japan, with an Irish-American father, and brought to New England in childhood, raised among my Irish relatives. And then spending my half of my adult life in Japan and half of it here, has been a journey partly of looking for that kind of mental wellness, and searching for it through these whatever insights I could find in different cultures, especially Japanese and American culture. And Dr. Pike started to refer to the world we're living in right now, which the U.S. military described as a VUCA world, V-U-C-A, V as volatile, U as uncertain, C is complex, and A is ambiguous. And it's created a world in which the kinds of leadership we've looked to are really failing us, because they really don't know what to do. And it's created, I think, a crisis in mental health, and which could also be, as Dr. Pike pointed out, an opportunity, though, for us to really face the reality of the difficulties that people have faced all along, but sometimes it's been very covered, and that this is something that I have sought to learn from, partly through this many years of studying psychology at Harvard, and then finding that was not enough knowledge to deal with really understanding the kinds of mental health crises that we see around the world, and then looking even to my Japanese grandmother for the kinds of wisdom that she had, and the kinds of wisdom that she showed in terms of how to live well. She lived to 111, and so there was some secret there to how do you live well for so long. What I've found, though, in my many years of work in psychology, of working directly with people who are having trouble, is that unfortunately humans learn very slowly and very reluctantly. We change only with great difficulty, and that often it's only through tremendous loss, accidents, illnesses, that totally transform the way we see things. Personally, I had in my 20s, I was in an apartment in Cambridge, Mass, and noticed that the building is burning down right while I was in it, and I managed to escape just with my guitar, which I still have, but it was the only thing I had, and I realized that I had lost everything that I thought was important, but also realized that the only thing that was really important was my own life, and that I was alive, and that I therefore had the responsibility to do something with my life. And this is something that many people find when they're confronted with death, with the awareness that we are all dying, the kind of Bushido virtue of facing death every day. And that's something that can bring us a greater sense of awareness of our own life, the responsibilities we have to ourselves, but also to others. It brings a greater awareness to us of our connections to other people, both living and dead. It brings us to a sense of connection to our ancestry, to our heritage, and also to a sense of purpose. We can feel a greater sense of purpose when we feel like we have survived and others haven't. And to question, what is the purpose of this life? How can I do something with this life? And I found that was something that could sustain me for several years as I built a career, and I got married, and I had children, and but I found myself also lost in my midlife of what Dante in the Inferno calls the dark forest. And partly it's something that many people face, a so-called midlife crisis and the empty nest, and but it was also something that was coming from the particular circumstances that we were facing. And in my city here, my son, when he entered high school, the day after he entered the high school, he found out that his friend had walked in front of a moving a train right near our house and had ended her life. And that year, 4 other young people from the same high school did the same thing. And when I was teaching at Stanford, I had come there, initially from Tokyo with this sense I thought I was in heaven because the weather was beautiful and the environment was beautiful and all the the students looked beautiful and healthy and happy, and they'd wave to each other, riding their bicycles around campus, and then I started to see what's called the Stanford Duck Syndrome. And as I saw the beauty on the outside and the serenity of them, like a duck floating on the surface, the reality was underneath there was a great deal of struggle going on, and that many of them had even come to Stanford with their medications, and they were seeing their therapists, and they were still struggling. And I saw a whole range of disorders: depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorders, suicidal tendencies, psychotic disorders, eating disorders. We even had violence against each other, among the students. And I felt I was reaching a point, like everybody else, of crisis about what can we do and what can I do to do anything that would be meaningful. After all, I'm just a teacher, I'm just a counselor. But I think that's where we can begin. We can begin with something real, something local. And I said, well, what can I do to be a better teacher? And how might that, if I could bring in my knowledge of psychology and counseling into the classroom, what might I be able to create that would help these students in their mental wellness? And so I started to develop courses for Stanford students, and also for Japanese high school students. So I wanted to do something also for youth in Japan, and started to offer programs for Japanese high school students. But the bulk of my work was focused on what can I do for Stanford students. And there I started to develop courses that to me were about asking myself, what did I know from my study of psychology of many years, but also what did I know from just observing people in my family, like my grandmother, and how my grandmother lived in a way that was more impressive to me than any of the people that I had met at the supposedly great institutions of Harvard and Todai and Stanford, who were no happier than anybody else I was meeting in life. But I still value the insights that we can get from science and from my own particular field of science. But I also recognize that we need something more. And I associated this a lot with my grandmother because people often, when she died at the funeral, people used the word kokoro, right? This to describe a sense of, I think that's very hard to define in English, but what I started to call heartfulness, which is a way of, I think, seeing how we can live more from our hearts than from our heads and from our minds, which is certainly the way that we tell often young people that this is what they should value. It's a kind of intelligence that helps them to be successful in academics, but it's not enough. And these days we really need to do much more to bring in all the kinds of knowledge and wisdom that we can to help enhance the mental wellness of young people. As Dr. Pike pointed out, we might have assumed that it was the elderly who were suffering, and certainly there is a lot of suffering there. But what really my eyes opened, as I started to do my online courses during the pandemic, and then starting to meet the students back in the classroom, to see how much they were suffering, and to see how much they needed the kind of guidance that we could provide, that I felt I particularly could provide as an elder, and something that they seem to really be missing in this youth-focused culture. And so what my educational program does is integrate these kinds of different Japanese spiritual wisdom with the knowledge of modern psychology. So something like beginner's mind, which comes as a very basic Buddhist principle, is also something that we now have a science for. For more than 40 years, it's been based in medicine, and it's a health. It's shown to reduce stress reduction when it's practiced, but it's also shown from research to improve cognitive capacities, to improve positive emotions, and possibly even to affect the immune system. So there are principles like this which are really come from the very basic teachings that my grandmother taught me. Every time we departed, she said, we may never meet again. Mo aenai kamushirenai. And then she would teach me a great lesson in life. And so to conclude, I try to bring together these different kinds of knowledge and wisdom because I think, today we really need all the knowledge and wisdom we can give to young people to help them get through this, what is really a crisis in finding meaning and purpose in their lives in circumstances that are extremely trying. So thank you for listening. I'd like to turn it back to Gerald, Hane.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Professor Murphy Shigematsu. Our third speaker is Yuri Sugimoto. Ms. Sugimoto.
Thank you, Gerald, and thank you, everyone. And today I'm very honored to be here with other wonderful guest speakers and event organizers and all the audience. From me, I would like to share my personal experience and my thoughts about mental wellness based on my past experience. And I will talk about the detail later, but the message I want to share today is that no matter who we are or who you are, we have a chance to change the future because of the weaknesses and difficulties we have. And our perspectives based on those weaknesses will surely help not only you, but others around you. And the first step to achieving mental wellness is, I think, is to identify and clarify what you're facing in your daily life. And next, I would like to start with my brief self-introduction in relation to today's topic. And in my last years as a teenager and when I was in university, I had a severe depressive symptoms. And a while later, I got diagnosed as a bipolar disorder. And since then, I've living with the bipolar disorder more than a decade now. And the most difficult thing I had to face when I was a student is that I didn't know and I couldn't get the reliable information and how to the reliable information about the symptoms and about how to deal with that symptoms at that time. And I didn't know how to reach those information either. And that was a very hard time. And I even hesitated to, for a long time, to ask for help to people around me or even go to a hospital because I had a strong fear that I should not get a mental illness. And that fear and all the hesitation made my symptoms worse. But so I if I had the appropriate knowledge and the environment, I can ask for help. At the time, I think the situation would have been very different. And but now I understand that the fear I had was the stigma I myself had about mental illness. So through these experience, like I learned with very much of pain that we need to perceive the problem properly to get a solution in a reasonable way. So it was difficult for me because I was suffering and I couldn't get information and didn't know how to ask for help. And yes, it was painful, but later this pain has been making my path meaningful afterwards. I like to explain the detail, and let me share the 3 milestones I recently experienced. And I hope these episodes will help you to get some inspiration to think about how to promote mental wellness, especially around you on personal level and hopefully to social level. And the first milestone was in early 2020. Very luckily, and thanks to the big support from Tuskegee Iowa Foundation in Japan, I got a chance to go to US to study mental health at the Harvard Medical School and at the Mental Health for All lab. And it was very great opportunity that I could meet and discuss the researchers running at the forefront in the world. And I had many discoveries, but I had to return to Japan soon, like in 1 month after my arrival, because of the pandemic started. And but still, this short stay had very big meaning to me, and this experience accelerated my adventure later on. And the second one, so after coming back to Japan, I and my friend who I met at the Harvard came up with the idea to organize a mental health study group, virtual mental health study group. And surprisingly, we in our group has attracted participants from the US, of course, and as well as from India, China, Bulgaria, Sweden, and some other countries. And they are from undergraduate students and also as joining as a young professional. So we had cross-cultural and cross-specialty interaction all the time, and that inspired us a lot. And even we are in the very different cultures and context, we often found that mutual issues among the topics about mental health and how to improve situation in own communities. That was very interesting, and I think this kind of way will help to promote to think about mental wellness for every kind of people. And the last and very recent milestone for me is participating in the Tomodachi Story Jam program. It is hosted by Tomodachi Initiative, and as the participants from US and Japan, we did storytelling about personal thoughts on our own disability. And there are all topics discussed, but what influenced me a lot is that I could find that there are very diverse voices in the world. And even though those opinions are not directly related to mental health, it is very insightful to think about how to build up the mental wellness for various people with different backgrounds. So these are three main milestones I recently experienced. And this is a very short episode, but I had hidden my illness for a long time before. But recently I become more comfortable with talking about it, thanks to all these experiences I had in the US and Japan. So it took a time, but it's really essential experience for me. And I used to use the phrase, I have a disability before, but now I'm living with a disability, or I'm living with a mental health problem. Because it's just a small difference in expression, but for me, this phrase implies continuity of one's life history. So now I'd like to conclude with the message I mentioned, that we can change our future because we have our past and we have our difficulties. So I really think that every kind of perspective can lead us to benefit all of us, and it will lead us to be more resilient and be more mentally healthy society on personal and social level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sugimoto. Okay, and now I'll turn to our discussant, Professor Takada Brooks, for his comments and questions. And just a quick reminder to the audience, if you have questions, please enter those in the chat. Okay, Professor Takada. Okay, great. Professor Takada Brooks.
There's an awful lot that was said within these three wonderful speakers. But I think that some themes that sort of ran across, or one major theme that ran across, was the notion of stigma and sort of the role in which sort of culture plays in those sorts of things. And I know that that is one of those sort of issues that are sort of challenges that sort of goes across the Pacific. It's both in the Japanese and Japanese American community. And this particular talk has been focused a great deal on sort of youth, or young adults and youth, and sort of the challenges that they're facing. And so I want to sort of place a sort of think about it in a couple of different ways. And one of them, that challenges that I see for us, like Professor Shigematsu, I work with students every day, and sort of undergraduate students, and particularly in Asian American studies, where I have a number of students from Asian American, Japanese American, Chinese American, Vietnamese American backgrounds. And so the sort of AAPI group. And so one of the things that constantly comes up for them is sort of the word trauma. So, and trauma coming from this, from the notion of intergenerational trauma, looking back in terms of Japanese American, Japanese and Japanese American, sort of the impacts of World War II, even for those born since 2000, it's still playing out in their lives in the ways in which their family units work, and sort of, again, the notion of shame, stigma, and the way that sort of trauma sort of lives on, not only in minds, but in bodies. And so it gets a bit complicated though. But the other is sort of intergenerational conversations and difficulties around sort of mental health. for older generations, Dr. Pike talked about sort of there was an expectation that seniors and elders would have much more difficulty. It turned out the young people did. And so that was almost counterintuitive. On one hand, we could say it's counterintuitive when we sort of put the sort of seniors in that sort of unable to adjust bucket, but they've lived through various traumas, right? Particularly the seniors. If I think of my mom, Dr. Shimatsu's mother, they were in Japan during the bombings. My wife, who's a sansei, her parents were in the camps. You know, there are various sort of traumatic events in our lives that have been part of our histories that gave us a reservoir of experience to draw on when that this particular COVID trauma hit. And so on the one hand, that's good. On the other hand, as our youth experience their sort of mental health issues, there could have been a sort of either shikatakanai, shogunai type of attitudes, or particularly in the United States, come on, toughen up. You know, that's gambatte. And so it feels like gaslighting that their feelings, that their emotions, what they're going through doesn't matter, right? You just have to toughen up. And I think that sort of becomes part of it. Another one that isn't associated with COVID that we've seen is around issues of gender identity, right? For those who are older, my generation older, we were taught very distinct gender identities, gender roles, and as our young people, they've thrown that out the window in some ways, at least in the United States, and increasingly in Japan, sort of non-binary gender understandings. And as they sort of bounce up against us older folks in sort of those challenges, again, a sort of gaslighting takes place, right? For them, gaslighting for those who are just, for them not to be heard, to say what they're feeling, what they're thinking doesn't exist, right? That it's their imagination. And I think, so I saw sort of that notion of intergenerational comes in two forms. One is in the trauma that sort of lives in sort of our lives and our bodies. And the other is in intergenerational conversations. And so I guess one of the questions that I would sort of throw out to the panel, right, is sort of how might we sort of use our cultural values and practices to deal first, with sort of this notion of stigma. How can we what sort of cultural practices, cultural values, I'm a cultural anthropologist, so the notion of values are really important to me. Cultural values and tools can we use to address this issue of stigma? Even though it comes from a cultural place, there's ways that I believe that I want to know if you have some ideas how we can use that same culture to combat it. And secondly, how can we use our cultural values and practices to deal with these sort of difficult intergenerational challenges? So turn first to anyone who can take that first. I know it's a big one, but
I want to go first. And this is thoughts I got from the virtual mental health study group, since it was among youth and very cross-cultural context. I thought that having a cross-cultural discussion or just casual interaction about how do we perceive mental health, mental illness with each other, and how to perceive mental illness or mental health is varied in like cultural context, I think. But to get common sense that this is a problem within every kind of culture, and this is different and unique in this context. If we could like clarify what is the main issue with each other, I think it would be very valuable tip, kind of could be to rethink about stigma. especially among youth.
Dr. Pike?
Yeah. So I'm reflecting on this idea around stigma, and I think one of the opportunities for us is to break that down a little bit and actually to try to develop language that takes us beyond stigma, because in fact, with more and more people talking about mental health, we have a real opportunity to uncouple the conversation from the historical misunderstandings or the historical prejudices and discrimination, and really try to be a voice for bringing mental health into a broader conversation around health and wellness. And when we do that, I think we kind of reset the expectations, and we say, going back to our values, your question about values, that we recognize that each individual, that each of us will be somewhere along this continuum of mental health every day, and it will move. And so we will, as Yuri said, we will live with our mental health and live with our mental health wherever it is today. And if we can begin to try to turn that conversation forward, I think it would really be valuable. I think the stigma, comes from at a very profound level, whether you're in a society like Japan that really historically is described as more of a collectivist society, or in the US that's more of an individualist society, when you are different in a collectivist society in ways that aren't aligned with ideals, it puts you at risk. And when you're in an individualistic society and you're different in ways that don't align with standard cultural ideals, it puts you at risk, particularly for young people, right? Which is part of why the issues around youth and adolescent without the experience are especially vulnerable. But to Yuri's point, the other opportunity that we need to give voice to is what people learn in the context of coming to understand their mental health, and the growth that can be part of that. And maybe that can help us balance some of the story. Also, talking about our mental health breaks down these barriers and connects us at a level of humanity. So changing the language, changing the conversation, and developing communities of trust where we can have these conversations, I think are a way to imagine moving forward and moving further away from the stigmatized experience that has historically been part of having a mental health condition.
So we see a little bit of change in Japan in that the new curriculum for the high schools, in which they're doing to roll out the awareness about mental health and to create sort of greater mental health literacy. But as with all things, the proof will be in when they roll it out, how they roll it out, how they talk about it, what language they use, et cetera. So I know that Dr. Pike, at the beginning of your talk, you talked about sort of mental health and mental illness, which are not exactly the same things, right? And so too often we see challenges with mental health or emotional health as a mental illness per se, right?
Mm-hmm.
Diagnosed mental illness, and they're not quite the same. And so how do you sort of sort those out, because of the stigma that people fear about the mental illness part of it, to be sort of labeled as mentally ill versus challenges with their mental health, right?
Mm-hmm.
Coming back to sort of the cultural question, Dr. Shigematsu, I'll just toss it to you.
Okay. Well, I'm teaching a course now for the Stanford undergrads called Trauma, Healing, and Empowerment in Asian America. And what we do in that course is simply what Yurdi and Kathleen have just described. It's really a course where I try to model and initiate set the atmosphere by bringing myself with vulnerability, meaning simply that I come as a human being. And that's something I was warned by my colleagues at the university not to do. They said, we leave ourselves at the door. And once we cross the threshold of the classroom, we are now a fountain of knowledge and information. And I said, well, I can't do that. I bring myself as a human being. And we engage in storytelling. We tell everyone the playing field is level because we all have stories. We all have experiences. No story is better than any other story. And by presenting ourselves as human, we also do what Yurdi described as you and Kathleen did too. You destroy that sense of that there are categories and boxes which are all determined by humans of what's normal, not normal, good or bad, mentally ill, mentally healthy. But I think there's a lot more awareness of that we're all living on these spectrums of behavior and of health and wellness, and that there is no strict division that can divide human beings in those categories. And that's what humanizes the whole process too, is if we can say, yes, we're part of that, we're part of this too. It isn't, you don't divide us and say these people are mentally ill, you should leave the university, and we are mentally healthy, we can stay, instead we just present ourselves as human beings with our stories. And you mentioned about intergenerational trauma, and what I'm finding in my courses is there's intergenerational healing.
Right.
And and this is something from the long experience of Japanese Americans, of dealing with not being told stories and then saying, but we need those stories now. My students go to their parents and grandparents and say, we want to know your stories now. And the parents, very cooperative, say, well, if it gets you a good grade, we'll cooperate. We'll cooperate with you telling our stories. But what happens is, just what we're all describing as an intergenerational healing process, to share those stories and as a way for us all to overcome these kinds of traumas.
I know we're running up against
Curtis,
time.
can I just comment here? There's a question in the chat that I think is really important for us to address. And I just it's a question about having someone in the family who's had very severe suicidal ideation and living with being seriously suicidal. And, I just want to not miss out on commenting on that 2 points to make. And first, thank you for sharing your question. And one is recognizing that when one person has serious mental health challenges, serious mental illness, it doesn't stop at their skin. It impacts many people. And so when you've got a loved one who's suicidal, that becomes a family issue, a community issue. And so the second piece that I would say is that as we talk about greater acceptance around mental health and mental illness, we also want to be sure that people know that how to know when they need or can ask for help. And so it's really important not to, gaman, that's good. It's good to be strong, but it's also asking for help is maybe the strongest thing you can do when you have some serious mental illness, and getting the right help. So using how severe something is, how impairing something is, and how enduring something is. So severity, impairment, and duration are really good metrics to think about getting help. And if it's severe, if it's lasting, and if it's impairing, there are people who can help you. I just want to make sure we address that.
So as I've listened to the three of you, sort of this notion of voice is the term that comes to mind. That sort of being able to speak out loud the things that are at issue, that are challenging you, that are bringing you joy, even on the positive emotion side, that are bringing you joy, just the ability to speak out, but being able to name things. And one of my classes that had nothing to do with mental health, we were doing the model minority image in Asian American studies. And I said, the first challenge of the model minority image is mental health. And you could see every one of the children, I mean, every one of the students just sit up straighter, and they started talking about how it was suffocating and the expectations of it, et cetera. But just being able to say it, and they began to talk about it, and they looked around at each other and noticed I wasn't the only one. And I think one of the things that sort of, for being a collective culture, we create these barriers that make us feel like we're the only one. And what I'm hearing from all of you tonight, and what we're seeing some changes in some of the corporations, educational systems, and then even the way we walk into the classroom, that we're not the only one. And that if each of us sort of shares that with whomever they're next to, whether it's one person or if you have a larger stage like a webinar, going international, to let you know that you're not the only one. And I certainly appreciate what you've shared with us.
Okay, I think I have to jump in here. Thank you very much to everyone. Our time has actually come to a close. So let me return to the president of the USJC, Suzanne Basala.
Thanks, Gerald. Thank you, everybody. I have so much I want to say, but I recognize that we're over time. But I first of all, I thought that I learned a lot and was inspired by the comments. And this just really, it is Mental Health Awareness Month. That's why we wanted to have this session. And I just see so much potential. I mean, all the speakers talked about the value of the conversations within communities, whether it's cross-generational, sharing of knowledge and wisdom, to find those points where we can help each other and find the opportunities to grow. And so I really thank the Gerald and Haruka and the other members of the USJC Mental Wellness Affinity Group for having this conversation. And it's not the end of the conversation by any stretch. And we'll be working together in the council with our affinity group to think about where can USJC, where can our members and our networks, which really bring a lot of expertise to this topic, how can we continue to support vulnerable populations and keep mental wellness and mental health at the forefront in the context of the US-Japan as individuals, but also within the context of US-Japan relations. So thank you everybody for joining us today and being part of this. And please stay in touch with the US-Japan Council. If you're not already a member, please sign up for our newsletter and stay abreast of the activities we're doing and continue to be part of the conversation. And again, thank you so much to our speakers and organizers for making today possible. We'll be sharing this video on our website afterwards, and we'll be sending a survey and look forward to hearing your comments afterwards. So thank you again. Thank you to our sponsors who made today possible. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day, evening, or afternoon.